All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're doing another deep dive today, and we're going to be looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Okay.
We've got some news from November 24th to the 28th, and let me tell you, things are getting, well, really intense.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a wild week, hasn't it?
It really has.
Started off, with these skirmishes and the diplomatic back and forth, but
Oh,
then
gosh.
huge escalation.
Yeah, let's just get right into it. Today, November 28th, Russia just launched a wave of missile and drone attacks,
Hmm.
and they were aimed at energy infrastructure across Ukraine. We're talking Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Odessa, even as far west as Lutsk and Rivne.
Yeah, this wasn't just like a targeted strike. They hit a ton of cities all at once.
Widespread is a good word for it.
Really devastating impact, too. Early reports are showing a lot of damage to power grids. I mean, a lot of these areas are just like in darkness right now.
It's really a scary thought, right?
Yeah,
Just how vulnerable civilian infrastructure is. And,
absolutely.
we can't forget that this wasn't just some random act of aggression.
Right. I mean,
So,
Russia's claiming that it's retaliation.
yeah.
They're saying Ukraine used Western-supplied missiles to attack Russian territory earlier this week.
So they're basically saying, you hit us, we hit you back.
Exactly.
And even harder, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think that's a really crucial point here, because if Russia is now responding to any perceived attack on its own soil with these massive strikes on Ukraine, I mean, we could be looking at a whole new phase of the conflict.
A much more dangerous one, you think.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay, so this is where we are today.
Yeah.
But to understand how we got here, let's rewind a little. What was happening earlier in the week?
Well, we were seeing that fighting continuing in some key regions.
Like,
Kursk, Kharkiv, Donetsk.
right, those are the areas where we've seen control shifting back and forth, right?
Exactly. And both sides have been taking losses.
And what about Kursk specifically? Weren't there some, like, territorial gains Ukraine made back in August?
Yeah, they did. But unfortunately, they've lost a lot of that ground in recent weeks.
So Russia's been pushing back hard.
Yeah, and they've been working on boosting their air defenses in these areas, too.
So they're trying to neutralize any Ukrainian missiles or drones coming their way.
Right. They're really fortifying their positions, upping their aerial capabilities.
Okay, so we've got this, like, back and forth happening on the ground, but then there were also diplomatic efforts going on at the same time.
Yeah, like the G7 foreign ministers met in Italy earlier this week.
And Blinken was there, right?
That's right. He was leading the charge. And the G7 nations as a whole have been very firm in their condemnation of Russia's actions, and they keep saying that they're committed to supporting Ukraine.
But this latest escalation must be making things really difficult for them, right?
It is. They're in a tough spot. How do they respond to this new level of aggression, but without making things even worse?
Right, it's like walking a tightrope. But, speaking of diplomacy, there was one small but significant sign of cooperation this week.
Oh, you mean when Qatar helped get those 9 children back to their families?
Yeah, those children who had been separated because of the conflict.
That was a really good moment.
It was?
I mean, in the middle of this horrible war, people are still trying to find common ground.
And to just offer some kind of glimmer of hope.
Exactly.
It reminds us that even when everything seems so bleak, there are people out there working towards peace and towards, reconciliation.
Yeah.
But it's tough, right? Because those efforts are kind of overshadowed now by this latest escalation
Yeah.
and, well, the potential for even more violence.
Definitely.
So where do we go from here?
Well, to really understand what might happen next, we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look at what's motivating Putin, the potential risks if things escalate even further, and how the international community might respond.
Okay, so let's do that.
I mean, this attack was awful, obviously, but it's not like it came out of nowhere. We've seen Russia hitting Ukrainian infrastructure more and more, especially energy facilities. It's been happening throughout this whole conflict.
Yeah, like that drone attack on the power grid in Ternopil a few days ago.
Exactly. That one knocked out power for almost 3/4 of the whole region.
But this latest attack was way bigger, hitting all these different cities at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It just feels like Russia is really trying to break Ukraine, like cripple their ability to even function.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's about disrupting their daily life and trying to crush civilian morale. It's brutal.
But it also kind of shows us how Russia is thinking strategically.
Mm-hmm.
Like their ground offensive has stalled in some places.
Yeah.
So they're resorting to these big attacks on crucial infrastructure.
Exact.
And you can't ignore the timing of this attack either. It
Yeah.
comes right after Russia accused Ukraine of that missile attack on their soil.
Right.
Almost like they're sending a message. You hit us, we'll hit you back even harder.
And I think the message isn't just about the damage they cause, it's psychological too. Russia is showing they're willing to escalate things, to make Ukrainian civilians suffer, all in response to what they see as threats.
And that escalation has got everyone worried about a bigger conflict, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Russia even warned the U.S. to stop what they're calling a spiral of escalation. They even mentioned Article 5, like hinting that could be triggered if Western targets keep getting hit.
It's a scary thought, isn't it? Article 5 is basically the core of NATO. Like, an attack on one is an attack on all.
Right.
If Russia intentionally targeted a NATO country, we could be looking at a full-blown war between Russia and the whole alliance.
And let's not forget, Putin himself has been getting more aggressive too. Like earlier this week when he signed that debt forgiveness law for new recruits.
Oh, yeah, that was interesting.
It's subtle, but I feel like it shows he's digging in for the long haul.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And when you add that to the fact that they just deployed those new Sarmat missiles, it's not exactly a comforting picture.
Makes you wonder, what are Putin's limits? What would it take for him to actually use those things?
Yeah, it's a question that's on everyone's mind, especially the people who deal with military strategy and policy.
Right.
It's a scary thought.
It is.
These Sarmat missiles are heavy intercontinental ballistic missiles. They can carry a bunch of nuclear warheads, and they're designed to get past even the best missile defense systems.
And their destructive power is just, well...
unimaginable.
So what would it take for Putin to actually use them?
I think one scenario is if Putin felt like Russia itself was in danger, like really threatened, maybe a direct attack on Russian territory, or if his own regime was about to collapse.
Like a cornered animal lashing out.
Exactly. If Putin thought he had nothing left to lose, he might be willing to use those weapons as a last resort to hold on to his power, or to try and save Russia, at least in his own mind.
And what about if NATO got directly involved?
Oh, that's another big one. If NATO sent troops or set up a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that could be a trigger too.
That's been a huge debate. Some people say NATO has to step in to stop Russia's aggression, but others are afraid it could lead to a much bigger war, even a nuclear one.
It's a really tough call, with huge risks either way. The possibility of things escalating is very real. But we can't ignore the suffering of the Ukrainian people either, or the danger Russia poses to the whole world.
So we're stuck with this volatile situation, no easy answers in sight.
Exactly.
It's like we're at a fork in the road, and both paths could lead to something terrible.
Phew, we're at a crossroads for sure.
Either a glimmer of hope or total devastation.
I think that sums it up pretty well.
It feels like we're right on the edge of something even worse. Russia's response to that alleged missile strike. It was fast and brutal. But where do we even go from here? Is there any way to calm things down?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Things are so tense right now. Russia's blaming the West, saying they're making it worse by sending weapons to Ukraine. They're saying the West is pushing Ukraine towards a fight that could have terrible consequences for everyone.
And we know how Putin gets when he feels threatened. He's already mentioned nuclear weapons if these bumps Russia's safety is at risk.
Yeah, that's the really scary part of all of this. Putin's been talking tougher and tougher, and his actions show that he's ready to take things up a notch if he has to. The question is, what's going to push him over that edge?
Well, we know NATO involvement is a big no-no for him. He sees NATO as a threat to Russia's very existence. So if they got directly involved in the conflict, I think he'd react pretty strongly.
Definitely. Putin's warned about NATO expansion and them giving Ukraine military aid time and time again. He sees all of that as part of some big plan by the West to weaken Russia and keep them down.
So it's a super delicate situation. Any wrong move, even an accident, could have disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
What can the rest of the world do to stop this from getting even worse and maybe find some way towards peace?
It's a huge challenge. There's no easy fix. But I think it starts with talking to each other, really trying to understand where the other side is coming from and finding some common ground, even if it's just a little bit.
But how do you even start talking when there's no trust left? Russia feels betrayed by the West, and the West sees Russia as the bad guy, breaking all the rules.
I know, that's the hardest part. Building trust back up is going to be slow and tough, but we have to do it if we want to avoid something truly awful happening. Those lines of communication need to stay open, no matter how tense things get.
What about countries like China and India? They've been staying out of it mostly, but they could really influence what happens, right?
Oh, absolutely, especially China. They've got a complicated relationship with both Russia and the West. They've been careful not to upset either side, but their economy is getting more and more tied to Russia's. And it would be good for them strategically if the West was weaker.
So we've got all these factors swirling around, and it feels like things could easily spin out of control.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and the potential for things to go very wrong is definitely there.
But we can't forget that at the heart of all this, it's about people. Millions of Ukrainians have had their lives turned upside down, homes destroyed, families torn apart.
You're absolutely right. The human cost of this war is impossible to measure. It's a stark reminder of how destructive conflict really is. We need to find a way to de-escalate, to make the violence stop, and to start helping people rebuild their lives and their communities.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening, but it's also been pretty heavy. We've talked about what's happening on the ground, the wider implications for global politics, and we've wrestled with some really tough questions about how this might escalate and whether there's any way to find peace.
We've seen how something like today's attack on energy infrastructure can completely change the direction of the conflict. It's a reminder that this is a very fluid situation, and it's hard to predict what will happen next.
As we wrap up today, I'm left with a feeling of urgency and a sense of responsibility too. The choices that world leaders make in the coming days and weeks, they're going to have consequences that ripple out across the world, affecting people's lives for generations to come.
I think we all need to demand more from our leaders, to push for diplomacy, for peace, and to hold those responsible for these terrible acts accountable. We can't just sit back and watch this happen. The stakes are too high.
You've given us a lot to think about today. This isn't just another news story. This is a moment that will shape history. And it's up to each of us to stay informed, to talk about this with each other, and to demand a better future for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the whole world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll be back with more updates as the situation unfolds.